and welcome to Moral Side of the News, our weekly discussion of today's top stories from a moral, ethical, and religious point of view. I'm Sean Kalin with the WHAS Crusade for Children. I'm joined today, as always, by a distinguished panel of local leaders. Father Bill Hammer, St. Margaret Mary and St. William Catholic Churches. Reverend Dr. George Wasson, Faith Point Church. Father Joe Graffis, Archdiocese of Louisville. Rabbi Stan Miles, Louisville Mountain School. And Reverend Dr. Kylan Gray, Creative Spirits Behavioral Health. We begin this week with the papal conclave that began on Wednesday.
In the late afternoon here, the cardinals beginning a ritual that dates back centuries. The procession from the Pauline Chapel to the Sistine Chapel, all in their red robes, their choir dress, their most formal attire, as they enter the Sistine Chapel, chanting the Litany of the Saints, asking the saints to pray for them in this moment. The cardinals chanting Ora pro nobis, pray for us. The cardinals then entering the Sistine Chapel, walking up to the altar and bowing, then taking their seats at tables lining the chapel. They sit in the shadow of Michelangelo's Last Judgment, each cardinal assigned a specific seat. Cardinal Pietro Parolin, the Secretary of State under Pope Francis, and one of several contenders to become the next pope, leading the cardinals in an oath of secrecy and vowing to not let their vote be swayed by external influences. Each cardinal then approaching the altar on their own, placing their hand on the Gospels, stating their name and saying, "I do so promise, pledge, and swear to uphold their sacred duty. So help me God." The weight of the moment on their faces. And after each one of them pledges secrecy in the Sistine Chapel, the famous order before the voting begins. Monsignor Diego Ravelli giving the order extra omnes.
Extra omnes.
Latin for everybody out. Those who are not electors leaving the chapel, and the doors are closed. This conclave will be like no other. 133 cardinals voting, all under the age of 80. The majority, 80% of them, appointed by Pope Francis. They come from every corner of the world, 71 different countries, the largest and most diverse conclave in recent times. The youngest cardinal, 45. The oldest will turn 80 next week. They will cast secret ballots up to 4 times a day, 2 votes in the morning, 2 votes in the afternoon, and a 2/3 majority is needed to elect a new pope.
So panel, breaking news on Moral Side of the News. That doesn't happen very often. And as we tape this on Thursday, the new pope was elected. White smoke came out, and this is the scene from St. Peter's Square just moments ago.
White smoke that we had been waiting for. And obviously we know that inside the Sistine Chapel right now, the 133 cardinals, the electors who chose the new pope, and one of them in that room will now serve as the next pope of the Catholic Church. You can see the applause down there in the square as the bells continue to ring. Lindsay, an extraordinary atmosphere here at the Vatican.
It certainly is, and just so much excitement. You can still see people in the area just running just to get near St. Peter's Square. We can only imagine the potential for hundreds of thousands. The square itself can hold about 250,000 people.
We've yet to hear a name. If we hear that during this program, we'll bring it to you. You'll hear it 2 days later, breaking news on Moral Side of the News, hearing on Sunday morning. But anyway, it's what we do here. So, panel, I'll turn it over to you. Your thoughts on the new pope and the conclave process?
Well, I think the conclave process is so ancient and in many ways seems archaic. Mm-hmm. Yet on the other hand, very interesting how they try to protect the cardinals from outside influences. Because there was a long history in the history of the papacy where the royalty and kings of Europe often wanted to sway people. And even this time there's been not kings and queens, but sometimes very wealthy people of various backgrounds who've tried to sway this. But they get isolated, and then they, even without their cell phones, which is always interesting, has to drive them crazy. But the fact that this is coming on this Thursday which would have been the fourth or the fifth vote, we're not sure exactly that, is pretty typical of the last two conclaves, but that they came together fairly quickly. I have no idea who, but it seems to me that it's probably somebody pretty well known to most of the cardinals, someone who's been around. Whether that's from the Vatican or in other parts of the world, I don't know. But it's an interesting process. I would think it might be whether it goes back to Europe as a pope from Europe, or whether it's somebody from Asia or Africa, or even Latin America, but it will be very interesting to see who that is.
I think it's fascinating for this to be taking place. It's the tradition of the church, and that speaks for there is one large universal space of persons of faith who continue to practice a tradition that has been held for centuries. In the midst of other cultures where tradition is not honored, it's not respected, tradition is almost tossed away. But we get to see in very rare times, and it's one thing that I celebrate with being alive to see this, is that there is a group of faith proponents who practice a tradition that continues to stand the test of time. And I think it speaks to faith, it speaks to the structure of Catholicism, it speaks to the history of Christianity in a large way. But what's speaking largely to me is that there's a global celebration of persons from every corner of the world that's represented there in Vatican City now, that's celebrating a tradition, unbroken tradition, that is continued to be alive and well, and with a great bit of hope expressed from all of Catholicism around the world. So that is what is worth celebrating, I think.
I just pray that the words coming from the new Holy Father's mouth and the deeds of his heart will be in the same tradition as Pope Francis, who really, really, I think, brought the world together.
Yeah, one of the observations is, I think, that always been through this a number of times now in my lifetime, that as these leaders representing the world come together, faith leaders, that they are saying we're coming here to let God lead us. And that's true of all traditions, all religious traditions, that we say we're going to let God lead us. Now, sometimes we try to intervene and do our own our own movements and things like that, but trying to sequester themselves, trying to minimize outside influence, to say, I open my heart up to whatever that discernment may be as it unfolds. One of the running jokes, and we've heard it in the media lots of times, quoted too. I mean, you go in as Pope, but you come out as a cardinal. That oftentimes there is a surprise that happens. And so I'll be, like everyone else, anxiously awaiting to see who this person is that was discerned and selected and then elected in the end. But I think there's some common roots in all faith traditions, that we do try to keep ourselves open to God's promptings, God's leading us where we're supposed to be going. And we do that because God chooses to intervene through human intermediaries as well.
Yes.
Again, in all traditions.
I guess some words that have been coming to mind for me as I've been watching this unfold is from Esther, for such a time as this. Yeah. Thinking about the global nature of choosing this next pope, representing literally every place on the planet that's coming together to choose the next leader for the Catholic Church. And really, this is for such a time as this, because I think that we're seeing amazing numbers of people coming to faith, whether that's in Catholicism or Protestantism, or they're coming to faith and they're hungry for faith right now. And so my prayer for this Pope is that this Pope would really speak to the people and for the people, but speaking the words of God that would draw people to this place that we know where we find hope and where we find promise and where we find a future.
He has a massive job. I mean, you know, I can't even imagine what that person feels like, you know. Following Francis is difficult enough, but then realizing all the peace questions that we've got in the world with India, Pakistan, Middle East, and all over the place, it's just amazing. And yet, trying to deal even within our own church sometimes.
And we do have one.
And we have breaking news right now from the United States.
Yes.
Wow.
Yes.
Robert Francis Provost.
Yeah.
Interesting man. He was one of the papali. Spent most of his time in Central America. So, and then he was called by Francis to become the head of the dicastery on the selection of bishops.
Yes.
So it's interesting to, boy, that's an interesting one to, especially given our politics in our own country.
Yes.
He was born in Chicago, I think.
I think that's right, yes.
Yes.
But kind of an outsider from a lot of different ways. It just came up in the last couple of weeks.
Yeah, again, I don't have a lot of background on him. I do know that he spent most of his role as a leader in the church outside of America, outside of North America.
Missionary.
You know, in that sense.
Augustinian, I believe.
I forget what religious order. It sounds right. But that, so in a sense, he is still a universal person. And in the sense that is, I think, something that maybe they discern somebody who has, for lack of a better term, short term, is some insider information. He has worked inside, you know, the Vatican. He has some understanding of the way that works, but he does bring an outside point of view as a missionary, someone with a kind of a global vision and experience, not just a vision, but a global experience. And that
He was a pastor,
yes.
and not a bishop very long. So,
No, yeah.
I mean, it's
But
all
has that
those,
experience, yeah.
which I think they were looking for someone who's a pastor.
Is he a relatively young
I
pope?
think he's 68 or 69,
I'm not sure.
I believe.
But did you see his name?
No, I just heard it in my ear.
My understanding is he chose Benedict.
Oh.
Oh, really?
I think I just saw that, yes. I think you can double check that, but I think somebody, again, we're using,
And he's 69 years old based on the information I'm getting right now.
yeah.
Amazing.
But I believe
about the right
I was
age,
told that he chose Benedict.
Is this the first American?
Yes,
Yes.
absolutely.
Oh my.
And nobody
Yeah,
ever
that's
thought
First American.
Americans would ever be
Yes.
elected.
Wow.
Yes, that's my understanding.
But having
that's
said that,
amazing.
again, he's worked outside of America
Yes.
for most of his
Yes.
leadership time.
Yeah.
He's,
Very, very, very little in the United States.
yes.
Was he educated in the United States?
I think,
I'm not sure.
I thought in Rome, and then a little bit, some of his education was in the United States. I think Catholic Theological Union, I believe, in Chicago, but I don't know that.
Yeah. Those of you who are watching this on Sunday, you'll know a lot more than that.
And maybe we can have a better breakdown on next week's moral side. But it's fun to watch this breakdown. And
Literally.
it's happening
It is.
live,
Live, real time.
Yeah.
real time as we tape on Thursday, and we all have our phones out. We're all getting
It is
information. And
Leo, I'm sorry. Oh, it's Leo is what they chose.
Leo
Leo.
Pope
Leo
Leo.
the 14th.
Leo the 14th.
Leo
now,
the
and
14th.
Interesting. After
what
Leo
does
the
the name-
13th was the Bishop of Rome, obviously the Pope that started what we call Catholic social teaching way
Yes.
back in 1891.
Yes.
So interesting that he chose that name as a follow-up of that, because that means he's going to be concerned about the poor and much of Francis's ideas there.
Yes.
Has Leo the 13th achieved sainthood?
No. Which sometimes
believe
we
so.
say we canonize too many saints. But, he was Pope for 25 years, so he was 93 when he died.
I think it's an interesting selection of the cardinals that may intimate their intentions for this nation.
Yeah. Well,
That of what's happening currently, and wanting to have a voice and a presence for what's the new influence that's coming globally for where our politics is. and for where the church is. Because one of the interesting things is that we've been speaking about is over the past decades, the diminishing numbers of persons who are practicing faith. At a time where now we're seeing some sense of resurgence. I just wonder what the cardinals, were thinking about as they place their trust and now bequeath the authority of the church to Pope Leo XIV.
Yes.
I'm wondering, is that speaking of the interest and intention for countering or even, bringing attention of faith back to the social types of things that now many nations around the country are trying to get away with?
Yeah, well, we don't know what all each individual cardinal said in the group,
Right.
but they're all invited to say what they see the needs of the church are. That is something that every cardinal is invited to speak to. Here's what we see the needs of the church, here we see the needs of the world, here's my thinking. This is before the voting.
Right.
And so I'm guessing some people were making notes. If I was in that room, I'd been making notes. And so I'm guessing enough people picked up on something that he said.
Like Bergoglio
Yes.
evidently made an intervention
Right.
that really touched the cardinals. at
Yes,
that
when
time.
he was cardinal, before he was elected. But yeah, so again, the process. Again, we won't know those kind of things. At least they're sworn to secrecy.
Yeah.
We'll see how that plays itself out in all matters. But
Right.
but that's the way the process works. So something he said, I think, resonated well with the majority of the cardinals there.
Again, maybe speaks to that for such a time as this, right?
Yes.
Because
Yes.
Yes.
the voting happened, it appears, very quickly. That and being quickly, it must have been pretty unanimous pretty quickly. And so, again, interesting.
Or the 90 votes at least.
Yes. Again, I think it's an interesting perspective because even in the United States, we've talked about the growth of the church in the continent of Africa and Asia and some other places. But really, there is that resurgence in the United States. And I was just reading about the number of young persons coming into Roman Catholicism that are Gen Zers who are searching. So it is an interesting dynamic to think about what, as you said, it speaks about what's happening even here in the United States.
I think it's also interesting that at least in the pre-conciliar conclave, that he hasn't written a lot of different things. So we don't know exactly where he stands on a lot of different issues, but it's kind of a middle ground person, I guess, that can kind of balance. I mean, I think they were looking for unity, someone who can pull the church together. Lord knows we need that in many different areas, as well as our country and our world right now.
What else do you make of so there were 13 Leos. Is there more to the meaning of Leo this is Leo the 14th, but the other 12 Leos before the 13th, is there meaning behind that he...
I think probably Leo the 13th is the one, because that
Yes.
was at the end of the last century, is the most recent Leo that we've had. But and I was telling somebody actually yesterday, I said, well, of all the names, I don't think he was going to be Francis. He probably wouldn't do John Paul, maybe Leo.
How did you? Yeah.
You were being prophetic yesterday, right?
Well, you need the Derby horse winner, too.
Yeah, there you go. It's a good week this week.
Well, I mean, there are certain senses, again, something about the original St. Leo. I don't have to go back and read it.
Leo the Great.
Yeah, Leo the Great, but that, like one of the most popular is John. There's been 23 Pope Johns. And again, I think that goes back to, again, a desire to be, a close disciple of Jesus. So I think, yes, there is some clear intention. Every Pope, very clear intention in the name. And I would think that he himself can reveal that, over time, why he discerned Leo. And because certainly Pope Francis revealed, why he chose Francis, because it was specifically care for the poor, and care for the creation too, so it will come out, and what the history of Leo is.
It's interesting that he was made a cardinal in 2019, which is 6 years ago now, or less than 6 years ago, and just before that was made a bishop just a couple of years. So, I mean, he's a newcomer among the College of Cardinals in some ways. So it's kind of fascinating to see how that coalition came together.
Pope Francis lived out his Jesuit orders as he served as Pope. we think that he's an Augustinian. What would that say of how he would?
Well, it's another religious order
Yes.
that's had a lot of history, and I think obviously named after St. Augustine,
Yes.
which is,
Yes.
has an interesting history as well. But I think that order has been a very missionary
Yes.
order, and all over the world. And again, I think that's probably another plus for his experience and for the experience of that order. He has been in all the continents because of some of his leadership position. I think he was at one time was the Superior General of Augustinians back in the early 2000s, stuff like that. But so it's interesting that is brought into it. Yeah. Again, Pope Benedict XVI did a lot of his work as a theologian on St. Augustine, so he emphasized some of St. Augustine's theology. So it'll be interesting to see where Leo XIV
Takes us.
I'm getting used to that.
Leads us, yes.
I have to do a mass tonight so I can say the new name.
Write it in there.
Yeah.
And his ministry was a Southern Hemisphere ministry
Right.
for the most part.
Yes.
Yes.
Which is looking at the largest constituency in the Catholic world.
Amen.
Right now, yes. Right now, yes. Presently, yeah.
I think he's worked in Africa, and I know he's obviously Latin America. I think he had some experience in Asia as well. So interesting.
And so now he doesn't go back to Chicago. He stays.
No, he's never been in Chicago lately. He studied there, and he was a priest in Chicago in his younger years.
I see.
But he's been in Latin America most of the time in the last 15, 20 years,
I believe
think.
so, yeah.
And then,
I mean,
of course,
I mean,
in Rome the last 6 years.
Yeah, but I'm sure he's got family in Chicago, I would think. And,
Right.
and if he discerns at some point to return to the country, I think it'd be safe to say he'll go to Chicago. And most of the time when they come to the country, they go to New York or they go to D.C. or, on the East Coast. But they've gone into, previous popes have also gone to places like St. Louis and around California. But I would think Chicago will be a stop someday. Someday.
So from the United States, would he have been serving here in the United States somewhere if he's coming out of?
I think he did serve in Chicago in a
As
couple
a newly
parishes.
ordained young priest,
yeah,
I think.
but that's a long time ago.
Yeah.
You know.
What takes a person who is an American and educated in the United States on this worldwide journey?
I think it's a calling that we believe that he discerned, I'm sure, with his community's leadership, as a young Augustinian priest. Those who are in leadership would have discerned, we see him with a certain skill set, a certain ability to lead, and therefore we call him to this position. It's not unlike all of us in terms of being discerned as to be a pastor and I.
Okay.
Right.
It's like you have a certain, I'm a pastor of this community or rabbi of this community or imam of this community, whatever it may be, that is a discernment that goes into that among a group of leaders who've observed. And so I think that's how it would naturally happen. And then as you begin to progress up, then other people begin to notice you. If you're an Augustinian, you're interacting with Franciscans, you're interacting with Jesuits, you're interacting with, so you begin to discern that as well.
Where one's God-given talents can be best utilized.
Right.
Yes, yes.
And again, being part of the Augustinian order, probably from the beginning, he was thinking of being a missionary.
Yes, that would have been, I would think, his
Right.
ordinary default. Yeah, just like certain religious orders in our tradition have certain what we call charisms, areas that they focus in terms of their work. And Augustinians certainly are missionaries and also working with the poor and the needy too.
And his last post was in the Vatican.
Right.
I believe so,
Right.
yes. I
Well,
believe so. Yeah.
since 19, he's been the head of the Congregation on the Discernment of Bishops. So
What does that mean?
Well, it's out of that dicastery, as they call it now, that they make recommendations to the Holy Father about who's going to be the bishop of whatever place, whether it's Covington or whether it's New York,
Okay.
So he has been involved in that over the last couple of years, and several other American cardinals have been on that committee, including the Cardinal Archbishop of Chicago, Supich, as well as Tobin from Newark, New Jersey, have been on that committee. So
Yeah, it's what happens for those who are not with the way the leadership is chosen in the Catholic Church. Locally, like in our area, like for Archbishop right now, Shelton Fobb, who's with us now, there are names that are regularly, every so many years, submitted, in our case, through the bishops' conferences to the apostolic delegate in D.C., then it's discerned by a group there, and then it's forwarded on to Rome. This is always like a pool of names kind of out there. And then from that pool, then usually a recommendation goes forward, but always usually 3. And then the Holy Father then reviews the dossiers. And again, not knowing most of the world, he relies on those recommendations. Now, he might know something about New York. He might know something about Los Angeles or something like that, in which case he might want to know personally who's going some of the larger ones. But generally speaking, there is a group in Rome that makes recommendations based on recommendations made to them.
I see.
Yeah.
So then what happens from here? Like, what are the next steps for the new Pope? What does his life begin to look like?
Well, he's Pope as soon as he's elected. But so the next thing will be his installation, whenever that may be. It could be as early as Sunday. I don't know. I presume they'll use it out in the piazza, as they would normally do. And then, of course, he begins his process. And he will have to pick somebody to take his place as the head of the dicastery on bishops, which will be interesting as well. But he's in charge at this point. And each of the cardinals, after his election, before he comes out on the balcony, each of them comes up and pledges their obedience to him. So,
And that was uncomfortable for Pope Francis, I believe. I remember him saying, I'm not Jesus, don't bow to me.
Right.
I mean, that was part of his humility and everything. Right. What a fascinating moral side of the news.
Breaking news.
Breaking news.
Right.
History-making moral side of the news. Remember, we tape on Thursday, but you're seeing it Sunday morning or hearing it Sunday night on WHS Radio. And thank you for listening and watching to Moral Side of the News today. Thanks to our panel. Thanks to Father Bill for coming in today to join us, as we suspected something might happen today, and it did. Father Bill Hammer, St. Margaret Mary and St. William Catholic Churches. Reverend Dr. George Wasson, Faith Point Church. Father Joe Graffis, Archdiocese of Louisville. Rabbi Stan Miles, the Louisville Mountain School. And Reverend Dr. Kylan Gray with Creative Spirits Behavioral Health. Thanks for watching. We're going to leave you with Moral Side this week with the moments of Pope Leo XIV being introduced to the public.
It would be impossible to overstate what this must be like for Pope Leo XIV from the United States. Let's listen.